The barbarian woman. The collapse of the Roman Empire raises an interesting question. Why did Rome crumble under the assaults of the Teutonic hordes, while another contemporary empire, the Chinese, withstood all barbarian invasions and several dismemberments of its universal state without any loss of cultural continuity? Indeed, it is not so much the political breakup of the Western Empire that ushered in the Dark Ages as the almost complete disintegration of its civilization and loss of cultural continuity. One explanation is certainly biological and statistical. Since before the reign of Augustus, the birth rate had fallen catastrophically in Italy. The lack of manpower was unconsciously symbolized when the famous Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, slaughtered in the Teutoburger Wall disaster, were never replaced. There remained a permanent gap in the army list until the Roman army itself ceased to exist. The erosion of family spirit, the widespread use of all available contraceptives as well as infanticide, and the desire for social emancipation on the part of Roman women dealt a death blow to Roman biological fertility. Arguments familiar to us today were already used to justify this Malthusian attitude. The unwisdom of bearing children in times of political troubles, imperialistic wars, urban congestion, and widespread immorality. As early as the 2nd century BC, both Cato and Polybius remarked on the declining birth rate and on the inability of the authorities to raise such armies as had defeated Hannibal only a few generations ago. In the 3rd century AD, after the Marcomannic War, the situation took a turn for the worse. The depletion of Roman manpower was fast turning into a major disaster by the age of Marcus Aurelius. There was little left of the virile population of ancient Greece or of the best breeding stocks of Roman Italy. Ethnic suicide appears to have been one of the long-term results of Rome's feminist movement. While the Roman Empire was rapidly becoming an empty shell, at the far end of the world Chinese society did not seem to suffer from any such internal ailment. The family system was preserved throughout Chinese history and was able to absorb biologically most barbarian invaders by sinifying them and thus preserving Chinese civilization intact into the 20th century. The historical fact is that the first barbarians who sought refuge behind the Roman limes, Rome's rudimentary Great Wall, and entered Rome's military service wanted nothing as much as to preserve the Roman Empire and its civilization. They were out not for destruction, but for conservation. For a long time, the barbarian infiltrations officially encouraged by the Roman authorities from Marcus Aurelius on continued at a steady pace. To an increasing degree, the actual defense of the empire was entrusted to half-civilized Teutonic warriors, but at no time were they ever absorbed by the increasingly sterile Italian or Gallo-Roman populations. Intermarriage between civilized Roman citizens and Teutonic barbarians was forbidden by law, as it was between free men and slaves until the empire itself collapsed. Had they been in China, the barbarians would soon have been civilized and absorbed into the immensely strong clan structure, to disappear eventually as droplets in the swelling Chinese Ocean. A loss of moral dignity and civic pride and courage corroded the inner fiber of the civilized people of the Western Empire. The more authoritarian the imperial government of Diocletian, the more reluctant the citizens were to abide by their civic duties. Reluctance to bring children into a darkening world increased steadily. In earlier days the Romans had been able to vanquish, civilize, and absorb the Celts of Cisalpine Gaul as successfully as the Chinese sinified their barbarians. Several centuries later, worn out and without biological vitality, the Romans were in turn overwhelmed by Germanic barbarians, who, far from being civilized by Romans, barbarized Rome completely. Healthy and simple-minded, the prolific Goths, Saxons, and Franks delighted in rearing large families and respected the tribal sanctity of marriage. So did the Vandals, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Lombards, and Alemanni, settled in the midst of the civilized populations as hosts or federati elis, They were at first awed by Rome's legendary power, by civilization they did not begin to understand, yet attempted to grasp. The Visigoths and Burgundians of the 5th century even applied themselves to imitate the outward style of life of the effeminate populations in whose midst they dwelt. The more savage Franks made no such effort. Under their rule, the barbarization of Gallo-Romans proceeded swiftly. The Dark Ages settled on Europe. The barbarian woman. There's every evidence that the Teutonic tribes were organized in a highly patriarchal society. All social power and authority to the men, but with a fearful male respect for woman. Tacitus has left us a highly colored description of the first Germans encountered by the Romans. Lazy when it came to agricultural work, but exceedingly warlike, especially when encouraged by their womenfolk, who often joined them in battle. Roman historians, alarmed and prophetic, compared the simple and vigorous nature of the barbarians with the slothfulness of the decadent Romans, corroded by too many years of peace and luxury. In his Germania, written in the year 193, Tacitus told his Roman contemporaries that the German women live in inviolable chastity, with no lascivious shows or provocative banquets to lure them to vice. Secret love letters are unknown to either sex. That is a land where no one has an indulgent smile for immorality, or calls seducing or being seduced the spirit of modern times. As soon as the soil was exhausted by extensive farming, the Germans moved on to other lands, which they conquered with the sword. Women were bought from their parents to serve as wives, and husbands had power of life and death over them, but only with the approval of the tribal assemblies. Nevertheless, women were highly regarded and even feared for their alleged magic powers. Adultery was extremely rare, as is the case in most tribal societies, and although they were apparently free to practice abortion, they rarely did so and usually bore many children. In the Golden Bough, James Fraser notes that the ancient Germans believed that there was something holy in women, and accordingly consulted them as oracles. But often the veneration of the men went further, and they worshipped women as true and living goddesses. For example, in the reign of Vespasian, a certain Valletta, of the tribe of the Bructeri, was commonly held to be a deity, and in that character reigned over her people, her sway being acknowledged far and wide. Goddesses in the flesh or otherwise were prominent, usually associated with soil and planting and harvesting. Whether they worshipped Mother Earth, Nerthus or Hertha like the Angles, or the Mother of the Gods like the St, they all stood in awe of womanhood, an attitude that largely disappeared upon their becoming Christians. The Celtic Druids held the same view and saw in woman something mysterious and unfathomable, partaking of divinity. Celts and Teutons were both close to their Bronze Age Neolithic roots. As for the male gods mentioned at the time, Thor, Woden, or Tyr, they all sprang from the Earth Mother, children of the predominating female principle. When the Western Empire finally collapsed under the barbarian flood, all legal and biological barriers between invaders and invaded broke down. In Gaul, the most prosperous and populated part of the former empire, Frankish chieftains began to intermarry with daughters of the old Gallo-Roman senatorial and landowning classes. From these faraway seeds sprang the feudal nobility that was to rule France. Elsewhere, in Spain and Italy, the same process was repeated. While the Angles and the Saxons invaded Britain, where the Roman veneer was much thinner than in Gaul, they in turn were eventually doomed to become the serfs of the Danes and then of the Normans. In Gaul, the Franks laid down, once and for all in the 6th century, the famous Salic law excluding women from the inheritance of any portion of Salic, that is, Frankish land, which may explain why, pseudo-paradoxically, women have been more influential in France than in any other European country. Frankish women in early Merovingian days were certainly not cowed by the Salic law. As in previous Dark Ages, After the collapse of former civilizations and the consequent barbarization leading to virtual anarchy, women play a conspicuous role in an extremely virile setting, which they eventually forfeit when culture and civilization rise again. Witness Greek women in Homeric times, and their steady decline in status thereafter, down to the days of Pericles. As regent, and then as Queen of Mercia, King Alfred's daughter Ethelfled ruled with greater wisdom and strength of purpose than any ruler of her generation, granted that hers was a relatively small realm. War between the Angli and the Warni broke out because of Radiger's repudiation of his marriage contract with the English king's sister. If we are to believe Gregory of Tours, the Burgundian kingdom's destruction was the result of Lothild's urging her sons to revenge the murder of her parents. And because she claimed to be ill-treated by her husband, the Visigothic king Amalaric, Lothild's brother Hildebert invaded Spain. The jealous pride of Amalabega, wife of Ermenfrith, was instrumental in bringing about the collapse of the Thuringian kingdom. In short, we have to accept the fact that unless we are prepared to shut our eyes to the plain evidence of history, we are bound to recognize that the personal feelings of queens and princesses were among the very strongest of the factors by which the politics of the heroic age were governed. Other women played an important part in Italy. Theodora d'Attliedino, wife of Theophylact, a prominent official at the papal court in Rome, arranged for the election of Pope John X early in the 10th century. Her daughter Marozia had shown her the way when she procured the election of her lover as Pope Sergius III. Then, married to the Duke of Tuscany, she had Pope John X, her mother's choice, thrown in prison and secured the election of her bastard son by Sergius III as Pope John XI. Dark as those ages were, and obscure as the records may be, there is enough evidence to show that, regardless of their legal status, women could exert enormous influence on the course of affairs, both lay and ecclesiastical, both for good and ill. The great German nun Roswitha made her mark in literature during the 10th century with her poetic lives of saints and her prose comedies. In other lands, women continued the religious work that so many of their predecessors had started in the last phase of the Roman Empire, as mothers or wives to convert their pagan relatives to Christianity. King Ethelbert of Kent's wife, who was a Frankish Christian, had no trouble proving to her husband that conversion to the most sophisticated creed of the time was the easiest means to achieve a higher degree of civilization. At a time when the Roman and Celtic churches were struggling for supremacy in Britain, Oswy, king of Northumbria, was persuaded by his wife to abandon the Church of Iona and join Rome, a decisive event which broke the back of the Celtic Church and brought not only the English but eventually the Scottish, Irish, and Welsh churches to join the Roman fold. On the whole, most women worked hard to promote the cause of Christianity. As elsewhere on the continent, manners and morals were coarse in Anglo-Saxon England. Lechery and adultery were widespread, and women lived in constant insecurity, an inevitable consequence of the breakdown of stern tribal traditions and taboos. Along with their children, women could be sold into slavery by their husbands and fathers. Husbands could divorce their wives at will and remarry whenever they pleased. It was only after the strong admonition of the Synod of Hartford in the year 673 that the Church was gradually able to enforce a certain stability in marital relations, which is basically what most women were striving for. Of great importance to the social position of women was the hectic transition from tribal to feudal society. This transition did not occur all over Europe simultaneously, but depended to a large extent on the temper of the tribesmen themselves, and on the degree of civilization that had survived among the native populations. The breakup of the Frankish tribes, permeated soon enough by the surviving Roman municipal tradition, was far swifter than that of the Anglo-Saxons in England, who themselves were moving away from tribalism far more rapidly than the Celts. In fact, One reason why Northumbria's King Oswy joined the Church of Rome was his desire to expel tribalism from his realm and introduce a Roman-type ecclesiastical hierarchy as a substitute for the old deceased imperial bureaucracy. Usually, not always, feudalism arises out of the contact between invading barbarians and conquered but civilized populations, as in Homeric Greece, Vedic India, or Chu China. Following the invasions, government and administration collapse. What is left of the civilized apparatus is no longer able to protect its subjects against unlawful aggression, and military power is monopolized by small tribal warbands and powerful landowners. As a consequence, trade comes almost to a standstill and large economic integration breaks down. Conversely, highly organized trade usually inhibits the rise of feudalism. The devolution of political and military power from decaying central government to increasingly powerful local magnates and tribal chieftains becomes unavoidable, and the feudal structure arises from contact and alliance between invading tribal chiefs and native local magnates. What happens then is easy to grasp. The kernel of tribal political organization lies in the overall and ultimate authority of tribal councils, over and above that of the chiefs. This democratic supervision, bolstered by venerable traditions, curtails to a great extent the power and authority of the elected chieftains, who can be deposed by the tribal councils whenever they see fit. When the entire tribe moves into a new area of higher civilization, however, it begins to lose, sooner or later, its internal cohesion through contact with alien populations and higher cultures. The tribal chiefs, anxious to emancipate themselves from the tribal council's control, strike up personal alliances with the local magnates, often marry their daughters, while the bulk of the tribesmen do likewise with the smaller gentry and landholders. The tribe begins to disintegrate, and detribalization is on its way when tribal chieftains, allied with the local magnates, surround themselves with non-tribal followers recruited from outside the tribe and pledged to personal allegiance to them. This new personal support enables them to free themselves from the public control of the councils, and the first ghostly contours of the complex feudal system become visible, erected on the ruins of tribal law and tradition. Its essence now resides in the vassal-lord relationship based on a personal oath of fealty. In other words, the binding force that now holds society together is not kinship but pledged loyalty between vassal and suzerain. This amounts to a substitution of one set of relationships for another. The substitution of blood relationship as a binding force for personal pledges based on an entirely new sense of individual honor, loyalty, and personal commitment. Both landed magnate and emancipated tribal chief become leaders of warbands. Their interests become merged through intermarriage, by an exchange of women similar to that originally devised by the incest taboo. The long-range consequence is the biological emergence of a new generation of leaders. As time goes on and the small fief appears as the basic autonomous administrative cell, an in-group faces all other out-groups. Relationships between fiefs are conducted on a long-term basis by intermarriage, and the exchange of women acquires its political significance. In contrast with the barbarian woman, the feudal woman's status is much lower. This social metamorphosis is fatal to woman's influence in all post-heroic age epochs, regardless of the type of tribal organization that is superseded. Whether cognatic or agnatic, woman's power and influence are always greater where blood relationship rules, and so is her feeling of being protected by tribal tradition. A striking symbol of this social metamorphosis is the far greater prevalence of strife between relatives, which is rare in a tight tribal structure. Women become prizes to be wrested. The abduction of Helen of Troy, Hyacinth's kidnapping of the Swedish queen at the risk of generalized warfare, woman becomes an object. With the rise of feudalism, a new hierarchy took over. The transition from primitive or tribal to feudal implied an increasingly sharp division of labor, unknown in tribal times, between fighting men and farming man, or between political man and economic man. Social specialization permeated the complex structure based on the feudal system of contracts and entailed that women, too, had their specific functions to perform. They could no longer substitute for men as they did, occasionally, in the dark heroic ages. They became mostly a medium of exchange between in-groups that were hitherto indifferent or hostile to one another. More than that, they became in a sense what they had been at the dawn of prehistory, in a barbarized land where, by and large, communications and trade had broken down. Women became again signs or symbols whose purpose in life was to be communicated. The exchange of women was used to bind men together. This social function was the outcome of the rules of exogamy and the prohibition of incest. In medieval times, women were less rooted in the soil than men were. Few were expected to marry within the limited confines of the little group in which they had been raised. They were usually destined to travel far and wide and cement new relationships and alliances between relatively distant lands. If we start at the top of the feudal ladder, that is, with the ruling princes, we must keep in mind the fact that a princess sent to a distant land for marital purposes became the head of a vast expedition with its own clerks and household staff, along with a great deal of authority over the expenditure of her often considerable financial resources. She could be expected to bring an alien influence with her which was often upsetting to local customs and traditions, but was also a powerful agent of cross-cultural fertilization. The marriage of King and future Emperor Henry III of Germany with Agnes de Poitou in 1043 is a case in point. While local German churchmen complained that now we see the shameful habits of French folly introduced into our kingdom, it was the start of a remarkable career for her. As one historian points out, the career of Agnes illustrates the way in which a woman in a great secular position could overcome the local limitations, which pressed more hardly on a man, and could absorb more easily than a man, with his more exacting political responsibilities, the disturbing ideas of the time. After 13 years of marriage, at age 30, Agnes became a widow and regent of the Holy Roman Empire for her son's benefit. 6 years later she was ousted and retired to Rome, where she became the major intermediary between the two greatest powers of the time, the Pope and Emperor Henry IV, her son. She was at the heart of the historical struggle between empire and papacy, and had to witness the emperor's humiliation at Canossa. As they traveled to and fro, moving from father or brother to husband and son, women became the main agents of cultural diffusion and dissemination. Witness Judith, sister of the Count of Flanders, married to Tostig, Earl of Northumbria, who soon left her a widow. Then remarried to Duke Welf of Bavaria, to whom she brought an extraordinary collection of English relics and manuscripts gathered during her first marriage. This collection, eventually willed to the monastery of Weingarten, became a prime source of information and inspiration to artists and scholars during the Middle Ages. What gave further importance to women as means of communications was an extraordinary tightening of the rules governing incest. This stiffening of the regulations resulted from the fact that, after the collapse of the empire, the Church's canon law became the main legal influence in shaping the new family structure, often owing as much to barbarian feeling as to Roman legislation. In the 9th century, what became known as the Isidore Mercatus False Decretals, a largely spurious code of Western canon law, imposed the Teutonic method of counting degrees of kinship from a common ancestor instead of the Roman method which traced them to a common ancestor and back again. As a result, the prohibited degrees of marriage were so considerable that, the greater the status of the future husband, the farther afield he had to look for a wife, thus spreading an immense net over the European continent that went as far as Russia and Constantinople. Until well into the middle period of the medieval era, the prohibited degrees were 7 in number. In other words, From the 9th to the 12th century, at the peak of extreme difficulties in travel and communications, men and women were within the prohibited degrees, if they had had a common ancestor during the previous 7 generations, when most of the time their ancestral knowledge and records hardly reached the 4th or the 5th. For instance, Henry I of England wanted to give one of his daughters in marriage to William of Warenne, Earl of Surrey. Compelled to submit a genealogical tree to Archbishop Anselm, it was discovered that they had a common ancestor some 200 years before, and the marriage was forbidden. It was not until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 that the doctrine of the false decretals was rejected, and the prohibited degrees limited to the first 4 generations, springing from a common ancestor. The Roman accounting of relationship degrees was reinstated, but not before the cross-cultural consequences of this far-flung exchange of women had come to fruition. The fact that women occasionally found themselves in a position of influence and even political power was not gracefully accepted by all men. In a sense, woman's position was further weakened when the medieval world began its slow retreat from the essentially concrete outlook on political power of the Dark Ages and early Middle Ages. In the 13th century, the twin ideas of political freedom and the rule of law cropped up in the thinking of philosophers and theologians. It all started with the English barons who initiated the Magna Carta. Freedom was the outcome of the rule of law. And what is law but applied reason? Tyranny is merely the absence of the rule of law. Any man who lives outside the realm of law is fettered by the shackles of servitude. Quite naturally, 13th century Franciscan chronicler Fra Salimbene lists the 5 kinds of rule which disgrace men: the rule of women, serfs, fools, boys, and enemies, all of which destroy rational order. As a historian points out pertinently, the inclusion of women in this list deserves notice, because it emphasizes the point that rule over free men should be rational. But equally in the theological and chivalric conceptions of the time, women stood for that which was either below or above reason. Woman in the person of Eve was the agent by which sin came into the world, and in the person of the Virgin, the agent by which salvation came. In courtly literature, women stood at once for that which was below reason, caprice, and for a higher principle than reason, love. But liberté, at least in this world's affairs, was a product of the masculine quality of reason as expressed in law. Nothing illustrates better the changing outlook of early medievalism than the metamorphosis of the conception of the Virgin Mary from the 9th to the 12th century. For instance, the transformation of the theme of the Virgin and Child and its gradual humanization. Western Christendom was already familiar in the 11th century with the dignified and slightly hieratic child, seated on his mother's knee as if on a throne, holding up his right hand as a sign of benediction, and with his left holding either a book, a symbol of wisdom, or an orb, a symbol of dominion. Then, gradually, the child's expression becomes more mobile. He laughs, plays with a ball or apple, caresses his mother, or is even being fed from his mother's breast. Such humanization had long been known in the more civilized East. In the barbarized West, it was quite unfamiliar. It reached the West from Byzantium, along with Greek inscriptions acknowledging the Virgin as Theotokos, meaning Mother of God. Humanization proceeded slowly. The mother began to lose her remoteness. The child began to give up his symbols of wisdom and authority. A sign of this altered status of Mary is her progressive emergence as a miracle maker. Until the 12th century, she had hardly ever been portrayed in that role. From then onward, miracle stories of the Virgin begin to appear, again largely inspired by imports from Byzantium. The collection of Mary stories grew by leaps and bounds in a medieval society that had been addicted, until then, to masculine legends. Along with this, a new type of religiosity typified by Saint Anselm and Saint Bernard introduced an emotionalism that was absent in the rough barbaric hearts of the Dark Ages. More than anyone, St. Francis gave added meaning to the subjective psychological quest of Anselm and Bernard, the reconciliation of faith with reason, the sublimation of carnal desire, the spiritualization of earthly longing for the other sex, the increasing discipline of monastic life that started with the foundation of Cluny triggered, in counterpart, a remarkable humanization of the great symbolic themes of Christianity. One need only go back to the famous Song of Roland, swan song of the Dark Ages, to see how things had changed between the sexes. The Song of Roland portraying a one-sided masculine society whose members are exclusively dedicated to the male group to which they belong rather than to a subjective quest of their own hearts. In this atmosphere, which pervaded Western Europe in the heroic days of the great dukes of Normandy, such as William the Conqueror, and counts of Anjou such as Geoffrey Greymantle, when priests, monks and bishops battled axe in hand alongside warriors and knights, and the feudal system was being built up on the basis of pledges, oaths, and loyalties tying men to one another, women were referred to only in the crude way of the camp. Men thought of their earthly possessions and power far more than their loves. In fact, their simple and primitive souls knew far more about lust than love. The dying Roland had no thought to spare for his betrothed. Aude, though she straightway died on hearing of his death. And when the heroes think of their lands, they think also of the ancient holy places of France, and call upon Saint Michael or Saint Denis, never on the Virgin. But now, a new age was dawning.